In this episode, we journey back to 1883 in the quiet spa town of Matlock. We will discover the bizarre and tragic way a respected reverend met his end. What started as an ordinary day turned into a shocking nightmare when an unlikely object, an old chamber pot, became the instrument of a deadly fate at the hands of his own son. Join us on Historical Crime Chronicles as we unravel the chilling tale of the murder that shook Matlock to its core. On the 27th of February 1883, Reverend Julius Benn, a well-dressed gentleman, arrived in Matlock, Derbyshire from London with his son William Rutherford Benn. Julius was a highly respected congregational minister from the old Gravel Lane meeting house in London, where he had worked for 15 years. He was 58 years old, but at 6 foot tall and powerfully built, he did not look his age. He was a man who believed in giving his time to the community through missionary work in the slums and opium dens in the East End, rather than giving sermons in church. His passion for change led him to set up a refuge for destitute boys in a disused rope factory in East London. This attracted Charles Dickens to visit the refuge. After his visit, the novelist wrote about the Reverend saying, "One could see by the expression of this man's eye and by his kindly face that love ruled rather than fear, and love was triumphant." The Reverend and his wife had 8 children in total. His passion and commitment to improving the situation of those less fortunate was passed on to his eldest son, John Williams Benn. John became a London councillor, then MP, and was then made a baronet. It didn't stop here. John's son was also an MP and was made Viscount Stansgate, and the Reverend's great-grandson was MP Tony Benn. The third son, William Rutherford Benn, who had accompanied his father to Matlock, a tall, slender gentleman, with a bushy dark brown beard and moustache, was highly intelligent. On the 1881 census, he is described as a merchant's clerk. He was training to become a silk merchant, but had many other talents, including languages and poetry. In fact, his poetry was that good, Florence Nicholson fell in love with him, or his poetry, and they were married on the 16th of December, 1882. This match, however, was not a great one, as Florence was quite immature and had some mental health problems due to the death of her parents at a young age. It all went wrong on their honeymoon in Paris. William suffered from depression, which got worse and led to signs of violence. Shortly after their honeymoon, William was admitted to Bethnal House Asylum in East London. Florence went back to living with her older sister, who had cared for her most of her life. There, she spent a lot of her time reading William's poems. After 6 weeks, the doctors suggested that William could be sent home. However, his father thought it would be a good idea to take William to Matlock in Derbyshire. Hydropathy was very popular in these times. It was thought that if you put water on the body, it would expel poisons and would cure many symptoms. This, along with the quietness of the countryside and fresh air, he hoped that the time away would help his son, and eventually he could go back to his marriage with Florence. Julius made arrangements and rented 2 bedrooms and a sitting room in a boarding house called The Cottage, at the bottom of Steep Turnpike in Matlock. It was run by a lovely couple called George and Mary Marchant, who took great care of their guests at the same time as caring for Mary's elderly mother. Mr. and Mrs. Marchant found the 2 gentlemen to be very polite and sociable, and they seemed to have a lovely father-son relationship. They did request, however, that their names be kept quiet, as they did not wish to receive visitors. Soon after their arrival, Julius asked the Marchants if he could have William's bed moved into his own bedroom. He explained that his son had been ill, but was better now, and he would pay the same money. Mrs. Marchant agreed, and was just so happy to have a gentleman of the cloth in her home that she placed a family heirloom, a blue Worcester Spode chamber pot, which had belonged to her grandmother, under the Reverend's bed. For the next 5 days, Julius and William Benn went on long walks. They asked Mrs. Marchant for recommendations of where to go. Taking her advice, they visited the heights of Abraham and Buxton. They went by train to Cromford, and then walked back home via Matlock Bath. Each day they came down to breakfast promptly, and was always back in time for dinner. Mr. and Mrs. Marchant were impressed at how agreeable the two gentlemen were, but on the 5th of March 1883, this was all to change. On the Saturday evening, both visitors behaved normal, as they had the previous days. They had dinner at 5 and then wrote letters. William wrote to his wife Florence and included a poem which he then went to post. At 9 o'clock they had supper, and Mrs. Marchant saw William lying on the sofa. She commented that he looked tired, to which he replied, "Yes, I am, very." Both William and Julius then went to bed, but soon after Julius called down for his son's topcoat. It contained a substance to help his son sleep, which he took every night. The next morning was a beautiful sunny Sunday, and Mrs. Marchant was getting dressed about 7 a.m. when she heard a strange thumping sound. Straight away she thought it was her mother downstairs wanting attention. She was quite worried about this because she didn't want it to disturb her guests, so she went straight down to her mother to see what was wrong. However, her mother insisted that she had not knocked, so Mrs. Marchant went to prepare the breakfast. Normally, Julius and William were up every morning and down for breakfast by 8 o'clock. However, by 8:30 there was no sign of them, so she climbed the staircase and knocked on their door shouting, "Breakfast's ready, sir." From inside the room, she heard a murmur, but she could not hear what they were saying. She just presumed that the Reverend was saying that William was still asleep and not to disturb. In the meantime, George Marchant went to church, and as time went on, Mary grew more concerned. She then thought that one of the gentlemen may be ill, so kept going to the foot of the stairs to see if she could hear movement. On 2 more occasions, she knocked on the bedroom door. By noon, 2 letters had arrived for the Reverend, so Mary made some tea and tried again, calling out to them, "Will you take some tea, sir?" She heard a murmur again, so left the tray on the mat and waited for her husband to return. George Marchant returned home from church at 1 o'clock, and straight away Mary explained the situation and asked her husband if he could go and try the door and see if anything was wrong. George went and knocked on the door twice, calling, "Is anything amiss?" He received no answer, so he tried again, louder this time, and the door was unbolted from the inside. The most horrific scene appeared in front of him. The young man William stood silent in his nightdress, everything dripping with blood. He then turned and pointed at his father, who was lying on the bed, having been battered over the head. George was obviously in shock. There was blood everywhere, and he was quite fearful for himself and his wife, as he didn't know if William would attack them next. George quickly pulled the door to and ran downstairs. He shouted to his wife and mother-in-law, "Come out! Come out! The son has murdered his father." George then ran to get the police. He returned with 2 policemen and a doctor. When Police Constable Smith and Dr. Moxon entered the room, Julius was quite dead on the bed and William was very weak. He turned and walked towards the window. The Reverend's bed was closest to the door, with William's near the window. A small horn-handled blood-stained penknife lay on the dresser, and they realised that the son had tried to cut his throat. They saw how violent the murder had been by the extent of blood everywhere in the room. Very calmly, Dr. Moxon greeted William by saying good morning, to which he did not get a reply, but he eventually got him to sit in a chair. P.C. Smith then held William from behind so that the doctor could sew up the wound on his neck. William was then taken into another room, while Dr. Moxon examined the body closely. He came to the conclusion from his investigation and subsequent post-mortem that the Reverend had been attacked in his sleep. He was lying on his left side, and all of the trauma was to the right side of the head. There was no sign of a struggle, as the Reverend's hands were still down by his side. It looked like there were 2 weapons, a heavy, blunt object which caused the damage to the head, and a knife causing lacerations. The room was searched for the murder weapon, as well as in the front garden under the bedroom window, in case William had thrown anything outside. They came to the conclusion that it was Mrs. Marchant's heirloom chamber pot that was the blunt object used as a weapon. It was covered in blood with hair attached. William was not questioned on the Sunday. He was taken into custody and was then accompanied by P.C. Smith to the infirmary. When told that he was being charged with his father's murder, William just gave a heavy sigh. He didn't say anything until 10 o'clock at night when he confessed to the murder of his father. In a dazed state, William said to P.C. Smith, "I did it with the chamber utensil." On Monday afternoon, the deputy coroner for the High Peak district opened the inquest at the Queen's Head Hotel at Matlock Bridge. The poor jury had to go and see the body still in situ, lying on the bed. The Reverend's eldest son, John Ben, had arrived as soon as he could when he heard the news. At the inquest, he asked the coroner a question. He said, "I don't wish to interrupt proceedings, but I wish to know whether the sergeant took possession of all the papers found of the deceased and my brother, and in the room." The sergeant confirmed that he had 5 letters, and also during the search they found a purse hidden under the carpet, containing £7 in gold. It is sad that the Reverend thought he couldn't trust the Marchants when really he should have been concerned about trusting the person he shared a room with. John Ben didn't want possession of the papers. He just thought that it was very important the papers were produced at the inquiry. He went on to say, "Mr. Coroner, I may say that my reason for making this request is because I believe that amongst my father's papers will be found an official document from the medical officer of the Bethnal House Lunatic Asylum, authorising the removal of my brother on the advice of the members of his family and the family doctor for a period of rest in the country. And it is for the production of that paper with a view to its inspection by yourself and the gentlemen of the jury so as to assist you in finding a proper verdict that I make this request." The document that John Ben was referring to was not found within the papers. The coroner would not take into account William's mental state of mind, and he was committed to trial at the next Derbyshire Assizes. During this time, 2 of William's brothers visited him. He seemed to know them at first, but then started rambling. He tried to commit suicide twice and was under 24-hour surveillance. William appeared at the Derby Court of the 27th of March, where he remained in a fragile mental state. By this time, the documents proving William's insanity were produced at the court, and on the 11th of April, William was admitted to the asylum for the criminally insane at Broadmoor. During the court case, the bottle that William had taken to apparently get to sleep was not properly investigated. It was well known during this time that chemists would sell medication for sleep that could contain what we now know today as controlled drugs. The jury didn't consider that these drugs may have caused the psychotic episodes that William was experiencing. After a very short time in Broadmoor, William made a quick recovery and regained his sanity. The crazy thing is his brother John went to great efforts in getting him released, even though he had murdered his father in such a brutal way. Only 7 years after he was admitted to Broadmoor, it was agreed by the doctors that it was safe for William to return into the community. John Ben wrote to the Home Secretary and applied for William's release. The release was granted on condition that John was responsible for him. William was reunited with Florence, who was very happy to have her husband back. As John was now responsible for his brother, they thought it was best that William took a job with an East India merchant and moved to India. He dropped his last name Ben and went by his middle name Rutherford. For a while, everything seemed to be fine. They had a daughter in 1892 called Margaret, and they all seemed happy. However, during Florence's second pregnancy, she became very depressed. William wanted to return the family to London, but it was too late. Florence committed suicide. He returned to London with Margaret shortly after and left his daughter in the care of her Aunt Bessie. William then went back to India to continue his work. He eventually met a young Englishwoman who he wanted to marry, however. When his brother heard the news, John thought it was his duty to inform the young woman's parents of William's dark past. The wedding was called off, and he once again fell into a deep depression. John felt that he could no longer guarantee the safety of his brother or others around him, and William was admitted to a private asylum. He moved around to Broadmoor and then eventually Stone Asylum, where he died on the 4th of August 1921 after contracting pneumonia. William's daughter Margaret Rutherford grew up and became a very successful actress. Ironically, one of her most iconic performances was when she played Agatha Christie's detective Miss Marple. Little did the audience know about the true murder at Matlock. The tragic story of Reverend Julius Ben is not one that will be forgotten. Although William got away with murder, his life remained marred by loss and mental illness. But from this dark tragedy rose an unexpected star. The Reverend's granddaughter was left to carve out her own path and became a beloved actress known to millions. His legacy also went on in his other grandchildren and great-grandchildren who went into politics, and his character is forever recorded by Charles Dickens. Thank you for watching Historical Crime Chronicles. If you enjoyed this tale from the past, don't forget to like, subscribe, and join us next time as we uncover more of history's most intriguing and chilling crimes.